Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott. I'm here with Samantha Hislop and Robert Crooks. There is a lot of conflicted and underreported news on Cuba breaking this week and all the time, of course. Something that caught our eye, it looks as if the U.S. Coast Guard is trying to deter ships from Cuba. So, Samantha, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, so earlier this week, I believe it was on March 24th, the U.S. Coast Guard has said that it's going to impose new conditions of entry on vessels that arrive from Cuba to the United States. Just to backtrack for a moment, let's remind everybody that there are already restrictions on maritime vessels that dock in Cuba. If they have docked in Cuba, they then have to wait 6 months before they can dock in the United States, which on its own is a massive deterrence to dock in Cuba or bring goods to Cuba or take exports from Cuba, because the United States is one of the largest. I don't think it's the largest market. Isn't China the largest market in the world now? Anyways, the U.S. has been the largest or one of the largest markets in the world. So companies want, if they're right there in Cuba or in that region, they're probably going to have a reason to dock in the United States since they're right there. So that 6-month waiting period has done a lot of harm over the years to Cuba's trade relationships and conducting business and importing. It's hurt the Cuban people really bad. So now this is an additional measure that the U.S. Coast Guard is going to impose on vessels that come from Cuba to the U.S. And the justification is that Cuba does not have effective anti-terrorism measures in place. So this has everything to do with the U.S. State Department reinstating Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. This U.S. Coast Guard restriction was going to apply to dozens of other countries too, the ones that you would expect, Iran, Syria, and actually 10 or 12 African countries as well, Yemen. But Cuba is on this list. And so vessels that are arriving in the U.S. from Cuba are going to have to comply with additional security conditions that have been established. This is going to go in place on April 2nd, and the conditions are going to include more rigorous inspections, operational restrictions, and additional verification protocols before the vessel can be granted permission to dock at a U.S. port. So it's more red tape, more bureaucracy. There's not much more details than that. It's and maybe we will get more details, but possibly not. It might just be one of those really broad things that, you know, they're intentionally not too specific, so they can just say whatever they want as a reason to deny entry or delay entry into U.S. ports and cause problems for these shipping companies, to discourage them from docking in Cuba going forward. So it's going to really harm Cuba's business relations with other countries, its ability to import. I think they're more overt than they've ever been, at least since maybe the 60s, that all of this is to try to overthrow the Cuban government. The intent is to harm Cubans. It's to make things extremely difficult and cause more shortages of medicine and food and supplies and parts and everything that they need just to have a functioning economy and functioning daily life for regular working Cuban people. Maybe we'll get more information in the coming weeks on maybe more specific details on the rules that these vessels coming from Cuba will have to comply with that they didn't have to before. I don't know, but it's just another measure. It seems like there's a new measure every week against Cuba from the United States. So we'll see what effect this has. It has been denounced by the Cuban government immediately, as it should be. It's just a coercive measure by the imperialist United States against Cuba.
It's, again, part of this decade-long about face, because there had been some cooperation in maritime security 10 years ago after the Obama thaw, where the Department of Homeland Security was working more effectively with Cuba. This escalation, I think that we might as well maintain sort of a rogues gallery or a list of the key players in the anti-Cuban offensive. This I saw attributed to legislators Carlos Jimenez and Maria Elvira Salazar. And these Republican legislators are really repeat offenders or aggressors against Cuba. Salazar was the Western Hemisphere subcommittee chairperson who reintroduced the Force Act in January. That's the Fighting Oppression Until the Reign of Castro Ends Act. I absolutely abhor these silly acronyms, but this is part of the longer shadow of Salazar's shenanigans, and legal escalations against Cuba. So it's really good to keep an eye on some of these fairly creepy, meddlesome Congress people. Speaking of U.S. meddling, our pal Marco Rubio is on a tour of the region, up to no good, but simultaneously making nice with people. Perhaps you could fill us in on what Rubio has been up to this week.
Right. So I think we talked about it on previous episodes, but before this tour, just maybe, I don't know if it's been 2 weeks now, the United States announced that it was threatening to revoke visas especially from diplomats of countries that accept Cuban medical personnel and participate in that, exchange of medical healthcare services and healthcare workers from Cuba. The accusation that those countries in the Caribbean are enabling or participating in human trafficking of Cuban doctors and healthcare workers was harshly denounced by most of those, many, I should say, not most, I don't know all of them, but leaders, prime ministers of those Caribbean countries. And most of them stood up and said, fine, we'll give up our visas. We don't care if we can go to the United States. What's more important to us is the well-being of our people, and we rely on the medical services that Cuban doctors and nurses and technicians, healthcare technicians, provide to our people. Many of these countries have pretty significant shortages of healthcare workers in their country for a few reasons. Probably a lot of it has to do with immigration. A lot of professionals leave their countries, just like what has been happening recently in Cuba, for economic reasons. It's a brain drain, right? So without Cuban healthcare personnel and having this relationship with Cuba where these services are provided to their people, their healthcare systems would collapse. And even with Cuban healthcare workers, a lot of them still have shortages. So if they already have shortages, you can imagine how much worse it would be if they weren't engaged with Cuba on to provide these services to their people. So now Marco Rubio has initiated a tour that started earlier this week, I believe. The first stop was Jamaica. And then I think on Wednesday he went to Barbados and Trinidad. Not that those are close, but I guess you could take a flight and go to the next one the same day anyways, right? But it's hard to know what really is discussed. Well, we don't know what's discussed behind closed doors. But it's funny, or it's interesting, kind of the tone that Marco Rubio is taking after these meetings. For example, after meeting with Prime Minister Holness of Jamaica, who completely rejects the accusation that Cuban healthcare workers in Jamaica are being exploited at all. But Marco Rubio, he had a very positive tone after this meeting in Jamaica, kind of like he's kind of backing off a little bit, not taking that harsh tone that he took before this tour that he started, with the threats about revoking visas from leaders and diplomats of these countries. Now he's kind of being more positive and talking a lot about cooperation with those countries on issues of mutual security in the region is kind of what he's talking about. So I don't know what that really stands for, what that signifies. And also, helping with their development, acknowledge and investment in those countries, acknowledging that, the aid used to be given or gone through NGOs in those countries, but now it's kind of going to be kind of more directly through the State Department. We know what the United States wants in the end, what they would like to come out of it, but it's hard to know what was discussed, what was agreed upon. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, he's certainly hedging a little bit, because the Trump administration, of which he's a key part, cuts such an embarrassing and belligerent figure in the world, and then he has to go out and make nice and so on. So, the Jamaican prime minister is using this opportunity not only to talk about the long history of the United States and Jamaica and so on, but he's making overtures to all the CARICOM members at the same time. It's a pretty embarrassing spectacle from what I saw, but Rubio's there at pains to underscore a realignment of trade and investment opportunities and so on. He's talking about, the global war on gangs, and he's using a lot of the rhetorical operators of Trump's terribly xenophobic orientation toward the Americas, and particularly free movement within the Americas and to the United States and so on. We saw what he did to Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan people living in the United States the other week, and so much of this is wrapped up in this language of a global war on gangs, and has to do with ascribing criminality to people from CARICOM countries and from the Americas. However, Rubio hedged on this too, and gave a softer version of this sort of rundown. Speaking, actually, he kind of reversed the typical language and admitted that most of the guns used to commit gang violence in Jamaica are from the United States. That's a little sidebar, but I thought it was kind of interesting, because Trump is hammering on people and saying, oh, you're exporting criminality and you're sending criminals and you're havens for... And then Rubio has to go there and stand shoulder to shoulder with people and make nice, and in the course of doing so admits, actually, we're kind of equipping your gang problem. And then he also, he's not walking it back, but he said very, very clearly, I believe the quote is, that the U.S. is not getting out of the aid business. And of course it's a business, but he was very clear that for all the cuts to foreign aid and the realignment of foreign policy and so on, that they would be providing assistance to Jamaica and continuing the mandate of USAID, under some other auspices. So, yeah, it was a lot of hedging, but there were some funny admissions along the way too.
I did feel like it was sort of a walking back, and I guess it has a lot to do with the fact that what happens in Jamaica probably isn't going to make it to the news in the United States. It's not like this stuff was front page news on the CBC either, right? Like, this is stuff that... I don't know about you two, but I was reading about in the Jamaican newspapers and stuff. But even the fact that Rubio went and said, well, no, like, by having Cuban doctors in Jamaica, Jamaica's not involved in human trafficking. We think that the labor laws here are correct, but we're just saying, globally, in general,
right?
Like, in general, Cuba's doing human trafficking. And it was really interesting how he explained it, because Rubio said, the doctors go overseas and they do this work, but the money doesn't go to them. The money goes to the government of Cuba, and then Cuba pays the doctors. Well, it's like, that sounds a lot like capitalism, except for the money that, like it's not like when you go to like a coffee bar or something, you don't pay the money to the barista and then they pocket that, right? It goes to the business and then the business pays their employees. But whereas in a situation like that, the money would just go into the profits of the corporation. When it goes to the government in Cuba, it goes to
the socialist government of Cuba.
It goes to funding the social needs of the people, including healthcare, including housing, disaster relief, education, all of this stuff. So I thought that, and maybe it is just because Rubio is felt safe that this stuff wasn't going to come out in the United States news, but I thought he was really weak, and I thought he looked, I thought he looked, like he just seemed really weak.
Like it was for their local audience, maybe, the way that he was speaking. Yeah, and I did notice too, even from the Prime Minister of Jamaica, he made a point to say in our countries, Cuban healthcare workers are subject to all the same labor laws. We have insisting that our labor laws are sufficient, therefore there's no way that this is happening here. Didn't really go so far as to defend the program as a whole internationally, just defending in Jamaica that this is not human trafficking, this is not exploitation. So kind of like leaving the door open a little bit. And the same with Rubio, like you said, like now he's kind of saying, it's different. It varies by country, it's done differently depending on the country. So that kind of leaves the door open for him probably in these negotiations with leaders of various countries. So that, initially he was saying it's this kind of painting it with the same brush. It's human trafficking, it's exploitation. But now he needs room to like maneuver depending on what these talks are, what agreements are reached. So he can't really badmouth each of these individual countries specifically if he wants to get some kind of concessions from them, or you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but it'll be interesting too, because I believe he's going to Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, I think. And I feel like Trinidad and Guyana are particularly interesting because of the role that the United States wants to play in the energy sectors in, all three of those countries, if they had it their way, but Venezuela's nationalized their sector and that's why they're sanctioned. So Trinidad, I believe they have a lot of investment from the United States in their gas industry. Guyana has, I think, oil and gas. Guyana had a dispute with Venezuela. So there's some tricky things like geopolitically there, and probably the United States is going to do whatever they can to exploit those, to try to break up unity or cooperation in that region specifically, I would guess. But we don't know how those talks have gone yet.
And even in Jamaica, both Rubio and the Prime Minister spoke about this, but Rubio was very, very clear that he was there to pursue opportunities for investment in liquefied natural gas and so on. And he was absolutely there to make deals. And to backtrack only slightly, this is also why he's still talking about aid too. One of the reasons why I think he had to put a different spin on that topic is because when asked directly about Cuban doctors, whom the Prime Minister was portraying very favorably, Rubio had to say, as regards medical assistance, we're happy to provide that. Mm-hmm. We're not ending aid, we'll provide medical assistance, and then, try to repeat these claims that the doctors aren't paid and et cetera. But he has to also reframe that as an area of investment too, right? So he's wheeling and dealing out there.
But you would think they would know the history, right? Because when the U.S. has sent medical aid, it's been the type of thing where they send a barge. None of the doctors go into the community. They stay for a couple of weeks until it's out of the news cycle, and then they're gone. Whereas these Cuban doctors have been there for a very long time, and they're setting up infrastructure so that the healthcare can be improved over time. And the Jamaican prime minister, basically the way he put it was like, if these Cuban doctors leave, our healthcare will collapse. Like, it'll be a disaster. And that's what the other countries in the Caribbean have been saying too. And I think that, I guess when you're face to face between Marco Rubio and the leaders of these countries, you kind of got to realize that your bombastic rhetoric that you use back home isn't going to cut it there.
Yeah, and I was glad that Holness gave him a bit of a ribbing, though collegial. In some possibly more optimistic news, there's an interesting development as regards U.S.-Cuba relations and sport. Baseball diplomacy, so-called, which is a really interesting kind of subtopic in Cuban culture. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, Rob.
Yeah, so Congressman Steve Cohen introduced the Baseball Diplomacy Act to eliminate barriers to Cuban athletes entering the U.S. on non-immigrant visas during the baseball season and then returning home when the season ends. The measure would allow players to retain their Cuban citizenship and return to Cuba with their earnings, rather than having to renounce their citizenship and abandon their families to play baseball in the United States. So I guess, this is positive, although I think this has a lot to do with not wanting to step on the toes of the billionaire owners of baseball teams who have invested millions of dollars in their Cuban baseball stars. Because as we know, like, Cuba produces top-tier athletes across the board, but also, baseball players. I find it interesting that in this press release from Steve Cohen, he says that we all know that some of our greatest baseball players are from Cuba. I just thought that was an interesting way to put it, our greatest baseball players. But yes, I mean, this is, there's obviously some positive things about this, and like a lot of Cuban baseball players can also be ambassadors for Cuba. And I think they have played that role in the past, but I think, not to be too pessimistic, but I do think this has a lot to do with not pissing off the very wealthy owners of baseball teams.
Yeah, totally agree. But obviously we would be happy if something like this went through. I mean, it's completely ridiculous asking an athlete to renounce their citizenship. Like, these people basically, they have to defect from Cuba, regardless of what they actually feel or believe or whatever. It doesn't matter. They have to defect, and then they have to renounce their citizenship, like you said, to have a career in professional baseball in the United States, which means that they're kind of like, they're cut off from their homeland. Like, they can go back to Cuba, and some of them do, but it's probably, it just, I'm sure there's some shame there too, even though, everybody in Cuba knows this game. They know why it's like this. They know they're used to this kind of political pressure on top of all the economic pressure. But no other baseball players from other countries don't have to do that at all. Dominican Republic, I don't think from Venezuela. No, they don't have to do that if they're from Venezuela. There's lots of players, I think, from Mexico too. But I just think of like the Dominican Republic, for example, which has a much higher GDP, but it has like such extreme poverty. It's a capitalist country. There is no universal free healthcare or education. It's really dog eat dog. They're athletes. They're baseball players. They make money in the United States, and they can go home. They can invest their money at home. They can spend their money at home. They can live in the Dominican Republic outside of their baseball season, like every other athlete can. It's only Cubans that haven't been able to do this, and it's entirely political. It's just a way to drain talent out of Cuba and cut off. They don't want to see cooperation between the two countries, certainly not in sports. I think a few weeks ago, there was a bunch of Cuban athletes that were denied visas. They couldn't participate in a competition in the US. I think it was basketball, maybe. I can't remember. But like, they're doing that all the time. They're denying visas to Cuban athletes. So it's like, unless you basically become a sellout, you can't come to the United States and you can't have a professional career in the United States like every other athlete could potentially from another country.
And it is a bit akin to a brain drain. I mean, like not in the same way, obviously, but like these baseball players are trained in Cuba, right? So there's a lot of money that's invested in them in Cuba. And then for them to, to decide whether or not they want to continue their baseball career to the highest heights that they'd be able to, they'd have to renounce their citizenship. It is really something that's not at all fair and, not in the spirit of sport either, I would say.
And it takes away from the younger generations. They miss out on coaching opportunities and, getting to play alongside or train alongside older Cuban athletes who should be able to come home. I think there was a baseball player actually that was retired now from Major League Baseball. And he did go back to Cuba and he was coaching a little league team. And he was hugely advocating for Cuban youth athletes to be able to compete in the United States. He was really promoting that and just saying he's saying it doesn't even matter what my personal politics are. We want cooperation, we want competition, we want to have this relationship. And so it's unfair to other athletes that are still in Cuba that are maybe younger. They don't get to train alongside their like idols or their people that they would look up to, could learn from. It is a brain drain. I don't know if there's another word for it, like a muscle drain or something. But yeah, it's draining athletes out of Cuba.
Yeah, sapping specialized skills. And I think there's an ideological component because it's pretty well understood that the importance and the centrality of baseball to Cuban culture is a facet of like post-revolutionary nation-craft. So I think it's intended to break morale, but an analogy to the brain drain sort of mechanics, the way that this typically transpires can be, I think, further pursued in that we were talking about the preferential immigration programs and parole programs available to Cuban specialists and so on, where people from other countries have a terribly difficult time coming to practice a trade or a specialty or whatever, otherwise integrating into the U.S. The famous quote of Fidel, that it's very hard to compete where that people are being offered $6 million in the United States and 3,000 pesos in Cuba. I'll briefly digress and say that Chavez said of Fidel that Fidel doesn't strike out. Great baseball player, apparently. But, there's this observation of Fidel that Cuba just couldn't possibly be, like, economically competitive in this regard, right? So you have agents in the United States trying to lure defectors with large salaries, outsized salaries, right? That have political conditions attached to them. And this, I think, should be counterposed to a little understood peculiarity of professional baseball in the United States, where you have very well compensated people in the major leagues, and the minor leagues are often compared to like indentured servitude, where a lot of immigrants and racialized baseball players are paid poverty wages. But this is because there are Supreme Court rulings that exempt professional baseball from antitrust laws and enable these franchises to collude to suppress wages. So, it maps pretty well onto the dynamics of brain drain too, where certain people are promoted above others, and their attendance is solicited preferentially for very clear political purposes, but the larger situation is one of immiseration and indenture. Mm-hmm. Another positive development for Cuba comes from the House of Lords in the UK. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on in the UK Parliament, Rob?
Yeah, well, again, it's there's some positive things happening and a bit of a negative background. So in the Parliament in UK, they had a debate on the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement that the UK signed on to in November 2023. And the reason I say that it's a bit there is a bit negative to it is because this agreement has been under review by the UK government since November 2023, and so there was some demands in the parliament to be like, well, why aren't we moving ahead with this? We agreed to this. Why is it taking so long to enact it? So just a little bit of background. The Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement is actually something, and it's an agreement that Cuba had already made with the EU back in December 2016. The document provides a framework for collaboration and further development of bilateral political, economic, social, and cultural ties between the EU and Cuba. This agreement rescinded the previous agreement or the previous policy of the EU, which was called Common Position, that had been in place since 1996. Cuban authorities have rejected the Common Position, calling it unilateral, interventionist, selective, and discriminatory. And here's a little taste of why Cuba said that. According to the Common Position, the objective of the European Union in its relations with Cuba is to encourage a process of transition to a pluralist democracy and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as sustainable recovery and improvement in the living standards of the Cuban people. So yeah, this previous agreement, or previous policy, I guess, of the EU was definitely interventionist, imperialist, and so that's good news that there has been this new framework in place for 8 years, and that the UK is also wanting to sign on to it. And the document is a pretty interesting one. It really reaffirms Cuba's right to sovereignty and territorial integrity and political independence. It calls to strengthen the Charter of the United Nations, to commit to, the international rule of law, according to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, which, obviously has its issues, but it is at least a legal framework that when countries are doing trade, they both know sort of the terrain on which they're acting. So yeah, this is a bit interesting in the development of the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement between Cuba and the EU, because there was a lot of discussion on how the Cuba really is really advanced in the areas of like gender equality, on promoting the UN Charter, on disaster management, on climate change, averting agricultural practices, on healthcare, and even touted Cuba's work on anti-terrorism. So it is really an interesting document that really flies in the face of the U.S.'s maximum pressure campaign. And so I think it is a really important document. So this document that the UK signed on to in November 2023 but haven't enacted was being debated in the UK Parliament on Tuesday, March 25th. And yeah, there's some really interesting things that came out of it. One member of Parliament said, "Every day is a terrible delay in terms of the suffering that it leaves the Cuban people in. Can I therefore press the government further on when they anticipate that this agreement will be ratified, bearing in mind that the previous government traveled to Havana to sign it? I urge my noble friend to consider provisional implementation beforehand, in line with what the EU is doing as a vital means of breaking the isolation of this very peaceful Caribbean island." Another MP said, 18 months seems a little long for internal government consultation on an agreement signed by the Minister of the Crown. Part of the agreement was about the U.S. embargo, and now we have seen the most recent restrictions by the Trump administration. So in Parliament, they're referring to the maximum pressure campaign of Trump and how they need to act on this sooner than later. There was even a conservative MP Lord Belf. I mean, these names in the parliament are ridiculous. But he said that on U.S. policy has made it more difficult for British business to intervene and get orders from Cuba. What steps is it going to take to mitigate the challenges of this embargo with things as they stand at the moment to enable UK businesses to engage more with Cuba and sell more products to Cuba? So it goes on, and then they also talk about how the UK has a lot to learn from Cuba with regards to healthcare. They say that Cuba, a comparatively poor country, has 9.31 doctors per 1,000 people and exports medical professionals. The UK has 3.2 doctors per 1,000 people, well below the EU average, and struggles to produce doctors. It has imported 32% of its doctors, speaking of brain drain, right? On the assumption that we can all learn from other countries, will the government study Cuba's healthcare system and seek its help in addressing doctor shortages in the UK? So that's even like leaving the possibility open of having Cuban doctors that the United States is saying are being trafficked go to the UK. They're even like leaving that possibility open. So I think it was a really interesting and positive debate that happened in UK Parliament. Hopefully this agreement will be ratified sooner than later. I think it would be a great lifeline to Cuba to sort of knock down these barriers that are, preventing trade and cooperation in other fields. So yeah, I think overall this was a positive event that took place this week.
I think we have a hard time imagining something similar being discussed in Canada at this time, unfortunately. That is really positive. I hope things will progress in a positive way on that front for the UK, between the UK and Cuba. And I only wish that those kind of talks were being had here in Canada among our members of Parliament. I feel like this is kind of going a little bit off topic right now, but I feel like generally politically in Canada right now, there's just this like belief that, this tariff war, these threats, this kind of deteriorating relationship between Canada and the United States, it's just temporary. Once Trump's not in anymore, things will go back to the way that they were. Like, I feel like there's not any true commitment to forging new partnerships with other countries and stronger ties to other regions, because this is just temporary and will always be the United States, best friend and little brother and subservient lapdog, basically. I think that's part of the reason why we wouldn't hear those kind of things happening in Canada. I don't know what you guys think, but
it's hard to tell what's going on behind closed doors with Canada and U.S. relations right now, because yesterday Mark Carney came out and said that the relations between U.S. and Canada have been changed forever. We can no longer rely on U.S. to be a partner. People on social media were immediately going to be like, oh, Canada's going to leave NATO and NORAD. It was like, slow your horses, I think, people. But
wishful thinking.
And then Trump released a statement on his social media platform. I can't remember what it's called. Not Twitter, but the other one.
Is it Truth Social?
I think so. Where he said he had a conversation with Mark Carney and it went really well, and he referred to Mark Carney as the Prime Minister, not as as he was referring to Trudeau as the Governor of Canada, and that he looks forward to speaking to Mark Carney more after the election, which I thought was a little bit weird, because does Trump know something that the rest of Canadians don't about? Is Mark Carney going to be delivered the prime ministership? I think it's obviously looking like he will win, but I just thought that was a weird way to put it by Trump. So it's really hard to know, and I think that the Canadian political class is definitely, they're speaking tough, but at the same time their actions show that they're trying to do as much as possible to not piss U.S. off too much, I think. Even though Carney said, let's open up and have more broad trade relations. That would be great. Let's expand trade with Cuba. Let's do trade with other countries, like the BRICS countries.
Did he say that? Did he say BRICS? No, he didn't.
No. He didn't. He didn't name any countries.
Right.
If he said that, I'd be like, that'd be something. No, but he just said like we need to expand our.
But
our
I
trade
feel
relations.
like
that's all he said.
Yeah. I did see that he saw that, but it seems to me that right now it's mostly focused on like EU countries, and it's not really. It's just doubling down on neoliberal policies and like more austerity and more military spending, as opposed to improving our relationship with China, for example, or with Cuba or whomever, and other regions of the world that historically we have either not had strong trade with, or maybe we had a very for sure we have very exploitative relationships with most of the global South. I don't see that changing, but
maybe Canada will sign on to the political dialogue and cooperation agreement like the UK did. I don't know. I don't even necessarily know if that would be positive. I'd have to look into it a little bit deeper, but
yeah, I mean, I think Trump can safely count on his ability to tank Poilievre with a larger right-leaning, constituency. Certainly their fortunes have to do with having tailed the Trump GOP to such an extent. As for Carney, it still smells like imperialism to me. If you look at his designs on military spending, I wonder what could be ahead in terms of Canada-Cuba relations, among many other things. Certainly political independence from the United States and economic independence from the United States is the prerequisite to good relations with Cuba. I think that will be an incidental outcome of whatever's afoot, because ideologically Carney has not expressed any such interest. In the UK, I think that this is a positive sign, and it speaks to a slightly different political culture. You don't want to take too much optimism away from the present sort of proto-fascist current in the United States and its foreign policy, when it spells calamity for so many people, but it could be the beginning of a global realignment, that popular movements for sovereignty and for global South emergence and for new multilateral relationships could emerge from.
Let's hope so.
Primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.